also? And is it
Yes.
part of palliative care? To what extent is respecting the choice of the patient also part of palliative care?
The second paragraph of the CMS definition ends on respect for autonomy and choice. So it is part of the mantle of palliative care. But you're right. I do hear us sort of revolving around this axis of suffering. And I'm aware that we rely on a sort of that the word suffering gets people, it's a motivating word. It's an animating word. It gets people, oh, I don't want to suffer. So it has this kind of call to action to it. And it's something that we can sort of, most people have some relationship to the notion. So it's actionable. But I do think we over rely upon it. But to your point, it is a piece of the puzzle. I mean, that's why I like to perforate the lines between life and death. I like to perforate the line between suffering and happiness. They need each other. Suffering is not like it's not some god that we sort of anti-suffering is not this. We're not at a altar. That is a part of the human experience. So it needs to be. It's a relative experience. It needs to be held in relationship to other forces in a life, etc. So I am with you very much, Paul, and I think my field is too. Where I see my field get into trouble is when we're relying in the abstraction, we're relying on our definition or talking about our field away from the bedside when we're trying to kind of transmit concepts. That's where I see our field kind of sclerosed and confused. At the bedside, when I watch palliative care happen, it naturally kind of flows into the zone that you're describing, where suffering is held in context and it's not the only thing that we're responding to, etc. So one way or another, the care at the bedside ultimately is sort of better than the sort of dogma would suggest. But there's a lot of tension there. This is an important point.
What if a palliative care physician said to the patient, this is a patient with decision-making capacity still,
Mhm.
I can relieve your suffering. I know how to use morphine. We can provide it to you in graduated doses, or I can use proportionate sedation, um, whatever the means be, and
Mhm.
you won't suffer. And
Mhm.
the patient says, okay, doc, I still want to die. I've seen one case in my life where the physician's feathers are ruffled
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
the physician is convinced that the suffering can be relieved.
Mhm.
And yet the patient didn't take that gift.
Yeah. So good.
Refused, you refuse the gift of the palliative care doc.
Well, so I'm laughing because I see this play out. And this is, I think, a moment of projection where we doctors end up projecting what we think should happen for this person, or more to the point, like, hey, I've got this shiny, this tool to work on you, this morphine or whatever it is. This is what I have to offer. Why are you rejecting my gift, my offering? It's like there's ego in that, there's projection in that. Um, but in this way, I think our field, this is where there's a lot of courage in this work, that you don't fall back on dogma and just sort of pat overly simplified definitions of suffering or anything else. This is where I also love the sort of existential frame. If my patients tell me that something is meaningful, whether it's suffering or anything else, but it's meaningful to my patient, I'm going to take that extremely seriously. And then it's on me to reflect, can I faithfully participate in this meaning making exercise for someone? There are limits to what I can do. It's okay for me to say, I've thought about it and I just can't participate in this. That's why I've said, then the next sentence is, but I'm going to help you find someone who can. Like it's important for us providers to be realistic about our own limitations and not overextend ourselves, because then we end up being ingenuinely involved with people. So anyway, I do think, let me bring this point home a little differently. I've been involved with several cases where my patients have hastened their own deaths through the End of Life Options Act. And to a person, as I'm going down my dutiful job of making sure their request to hasten their death is durable, is not being pressured from external forces, it's not due to untreated pain or depression, etc. So I go down my list to make sure, if I'm watching how it's set up, my job is to make sure their suffering, A, is not amenable to other treatments, or B, is intractable, that I have nothing more to offer. And as a last resort, I can sanction their death and help them off the planet. That's how it's set up as a provider. That's the way I'm supposed to do it. But that's not really how it plays out. Every case I've been involved in, they bring up what you're bringing up. These folks weren't really suffering. They were telling me that this was a meaningful way for them to close out their life, a last act of their will. It was a way for them to bring their life to a close in a way that was meaningful to them. That wasn't a flight from suffering. They knew the game, so we'd go into theater where they'd have to like somehow chart that they're miserable, but they weren't even miserable. They're saying, look, I'm not suffering, but I want to do this because it's meaningful to me. It's important to me. Can you help? And so I walked into those situations, and I did complete the task, not because they were miserable or suffering, but because they demonstrated to me in a clear relational way that this was a meaningful, durable request, and it was my honor and privilege to participate in it in that way. Would that meet the letter of the law? How would that hold up in a court of law, or does that really meet the regulations? I'm not so sure.
In some states, it would.
Yeah.
It would meet. I think. I'm not a lawyer, but again, I laud you for, I think, your very sensitive discernment here and your wider conception of what palliative care is about. It is not just about the relief of suffering, although it must first try to make all suffering that can be alleviated so that the patient who decides that, well, now's the time, I'm going to end things by refusing life-saving treatment or by some more active lethal means or by stopping eating, that patient is not doing it because of their fear of suffering or their current experience of suffering that can be alleviated by good palliative care. That's your mission in this package. And in that sense, I think it's a very high mission, the alleviation of suffering. And it leads to greater autonomy of the patient, greater freedom of choice, that they're not being, quote, forced into this by a mistaken perception that their suffering can't be alleviated. Because maybe it can be, due to the talents of youth palliative care nurses and physicians. But it seems to me that you're distinguishing things very appropriately here. There is another question, though. What if a person said, well, I don't want to burden others, and I know how extreme the burdens to others can be in caring for me if I live another 4 years in this condition. Can I suffer if I'm forced to live and therefore burden others? It seems to me that burdening others, burdening my loved ones in ways that I think is unnecessary, and it would be better if I did not do, if I act in such a way that they wouldn't be burdened. Now let's assume also they're not complaining loved ones. They're not people who complain about the burdens. I just know they're burdened by the care they have to continue so lovingly to give me. They want to give it because they love me, but I know it's a burden to them also. And now if somebody denies me the right to make the decision to end my life, because that's what I want to avoid, burdening others, isn't that imposing suffering on me? To have to live knowing that I'm burdening the loved ones whom I don't want to burden?
There's a lot to talk out there. This is why this work is so not transactional. Like we need to sit, I need to really tease this out with a specific person. It requires a lot of back and forth. It's a little bit like, so part of me wants to say to you, yeah, Paul, yeah, you're right. If you're a burden, that you're right. Requiring care is burdensome. Okay. And then for me, I would like to sort of dig in and say, like, okay, this is back to the myth of independence. The fact that we're always needing each other, that is a natural state of reality, So I think it's worthwhile in teasing out the unnecessary suffering, the invented suffering versus the necessary stuff. In this way, one of the ways we tease this out is like, maybe your attitude shifts around being a burden when you realize that everyone's a burden, that all of life there's another way of looking at sort of daily life. There's another lens we can look at daily life. And sure, maybe as we get closer to the end or advancing illness or disability, we have a bigger burden, but it's not like it's burden if you're sick and no burden if you're not sick. So sometimes I can get far with patients and families by sort of opening these constructs up like we've been doing and finding more space around it. And people then can sometimes say, well, you know what? Gosh, you're right. Life is a burden, and hey, I took care of my kids and now they're taking care of me, and we can maybe find some perspective so that sense of burden eases. Not always though. Not always though.
Not all.
That's right. And so here again, my job is to help make sure someone's eyes are as wide open as they can be, that they are supported as they can be, that they have a safe place to reflect and to find their own way, rather than me bestowing something on them. I'm here as a reflective, supportive, loving tool so they can figure themselves out. So if after a lot of work together, you say, yeah, I've thought about it, but fine, maybe all of life's a burden, but this is just too much. I don't want to keep doing this. At that point, then I have a much easier time accompanying them into taking action, whatever that may be. But not until I really, really know that person. They really, really are looking, and that I know they're looking inward and taking, So a lot of work needs to happen before I accede to that.
It tells me that some people in palliative care, like yourselves, have really put these pieces together in very sensitive ways. That is, they haven't just oversimplified their mission and the field by saying it's all about the alleviation of suffering. There are other dimensions. There's also a positive dimension of suffering. So sometimes our mission isn't to rail against suffering, but to accept it and deal with it. And there's many dimensions here.